This is a webinar on the biomechanics and physics of alpine skiing. But wait, before you take off on me, I get it. This is about as dry and boring of a topic as it gets. And that's a shame to me, because if there's a topic that has single-handedly contributed the most to my technical understanding of skiing, it's biomechanics and physics. But rather than go on with the usual boring drivel on this topic, I'm going to present a slightly different and fun approach to thinking about skiing physics, with practical takeaways that you can apply to your own skiing or teaching others. I hope you're able to recognize the many hours that went into creating the visuals for this webinar. And so, without further ado, here's the webinar from, well, at least the point where I finally remembered to hit the record button. As most of you know who are on this call tonight, I'm a staff trainer and instructor at Okemo Mountain Resort, and I'm super grateful for the opportunity to kind of be the host of these Okemo Tech Talks and bringing guest speakers from all over the country. It's very much in thanks to our wonderful management at Okemo for helping me put these on. I'm currently a member of the PSIA Eastern Region's Alpine Development Team, but I have a background in electrical engineering, and I actually actively work as a software engineer when I'm not on snow. And I think that background is sort of why I've been able to trudge through the fields of biomechanics and physics, because if there's masters of the dry and boring, it's engineers. But before the ski industry kind of captured me and derailed what I thought I wanted to do in life, I actually had a really huge interest in using the electrical engineering part of my degree to work on interfacing our body's own electrical systems with electronics. One of Elon Musk's many companies, Neuralink, has kind of become one of the more well-known names in the sector now, working on interfacing the brain directly with computer systems. And so my interest in biomechanics and physics actually dates back to before I started teaching skiing. And I actually started studying it a lot while I was in college. And this is actually an old video I dug up of me and a lab partner working on a project that used the electrical signals in your muscles to control a series of electrical motors. And that's a readout on the screen of those electrical signals. So why do I care so much about this topic? The first main point is that biomechanics and physics are objective, right? There's a lot of opinions about skiing and ski technique that get passed off as fact. Like, I'm sure we've all heard one thing in our careers only to find out later that that was totally wrong. And it doesn't get much more black and white than the laws of physics, right? And understanding how our bodies move and cannot move, right? There's not really a way to get around physics and the capabilities and limitations of our bodies. But more than that, the fundamentals or the skills concept only tells us so much. We all know that we need to be controlling the center of mass relative to the base of support, right? To distribute pressure along the length of our skis. We all know that the legs need to turn separate from our upper bodies, right? But why? Why do we do those things? And more importantly, how? Right? Biomechanics and physics are not derived from ski and technique. They've kind of existed for a long time before skiing and ski technique were developed. But ski technique, on the other hand, and the fundamentals and the skills concept, they were derived from physics and biomechanics. Physics defines the why, and biomechanics kind of defines the how. And the last kind of point here is particularly for those going for assessments. This screenshot at the bottom here is from the assessment performance guide. You don't really need to read it unless you really want to, but you'll see that it is specifically spelled out in the expectations when you go for a teaching assessment that you understand the impact of physical forces and how individual body movements contribute to ski performance. Right? And this makes sense because we're being tested on our ability to be ski instructors, right? And create positive change in the skiers in front of us. And if we don't understand the how or the why, then it's kind of hard to be effective coaches sometimes and help create that change. So here's what we won't be doing tonight, though, right? You won't be walking away with a PhD in anatomy and physiology, and nor will we be, I don't know, exploring quantum superposition and what awful things Schrodinger may or may not have done to his cat. we won't be getting super terminology heavy. Obviously it's a bit of a technical topic, so there's no avoiding a little bit. But we won't be diving into like types of joints and muscle insertion points and anything crazy like that. If you want that, just open up your technical manual to page 59. But what we will be doing tonight is kind of exploring what I think is hopefully a little bit of a simpler way to think about skiing physics and some essential parts of biomechanics. And in general, we'll be covering, I think, just it's a few of the pieces that have made some of the biggest impact on my own understanding of biomechanics and physics, and some of the kind of core details that have been super helpful to me as an instructor, whether I'm coaching students or going to an assessment. So let's start with this, right? We can think of skiing as a game, and I think you'll all agree it's a pretty awesome, fun game, right? You can play it by yourself, challenging yourself to get better each day. Or even, contrary to popular belief, it can be a multiplayer game, even on powder days. And so how do we play this game? I'm sure you've all seen a joystick at this point, or have a kind of an idea of how they work at least, right? Whether it's the classic Atari style that you put your hand around, or a more modern controller where you control the joysticks with just your thumbs, right? You can push them up, down, left, right, or some combination of any of those directions. And I'm sure this is blatantly obvious to some of those who are younger here. But on these modern joysticks, like you see on the right, you can actually push them down as well. They depress like a button. And that might come in handy a little bit later. And so we've got our Okemo Tech Talks controller here on the right, and our skier on the left, and we can control our skier using this joystick. Most games that are like super easy aren't fun, right? We need a challenge to engage us. And this is the challenge of our ski game. I know I said I wasn't going to get too terminology heavy, but I want to cover a couple little bases here. Just a couple of terms I'm sure many of us are familiar with, but I don't want to take them for granted, as they're fundamental to understanding ski physics. And that first term is center of mass, right? It's just the central balance point of an object's mass. Like if you take the average of an object's mass and find the middle point of it, that's the center of mass. When we have nice shapes like a circle or a square, that center of mass is kind of easy to visually determine where that's at. But as soon as like the shapes start getting a little weird, right, it starts getting a little harder to determine where that center of mass point actually is. For us, as weirdly shaped humans, ours is typically, on average, located a little below and behind our belly button. Obviously, we're all shaped a little differently, and that can change from person to person, especially in children, as many of us know, where it can sit much higher. But another example of this is just a bit of a callback to the old planking trend. Any of you guys remember this? Where people were planking on random objects, right? But specifically, some of the more challenging examples, like these, where they're balanced on a thin point, right? Do you notice where that balance point ends up? Right? It's pretty close to that belly button area, aka their center of mass, right? And they're able to balance on these narrow points because they've aligned their center of mass with those points. Base of support, on the other hand, is the area covered by every point of contact with a supporting surface, right? Some people think of the base of support as a point, and it's certainly much easier to draw and visualize that way, but it's actually more of an area. In skiing, our base of support is our skis. They're long and help stabilize us forwards and backwards along the length of our skis. But laterally is a little different. Laterally is a little different story, right? When we tip them up on edge, at least when the snow is firmer, our base of support gets concentrated to a pretty narrow point along the edges of the ski. And that's a little bit on purpose, right? Skiing is a very lateral sport, and stability is not always a good thing, right? Stability allows us to trust things like tripods with expensive cameras without worrying about them tipping over. But we kind of want to tip over a bit in skiing, right? And stability can limit how much we can move, and having less stability laterally allows us to move laterally, far more than we can move fore and aft, generally speaking. Right? If our base of support was above our center of mass, like with Magnus here, who was trying to set a single arm hang world record, the center of mass finds its centered balance point very easy, right? In this case, the base of support is his hand, and thanks to gravity, the center of mass falls directly underneath that base of support without any like real effort to achieve that on his behalf. But what if we flip that equation and we place that base of support below the center of mass? And not that doing a one-arm hang isn't incredibly difficult, but the equation changes from a challenge of grip strength to a challenge now of balance. The second this center of mass point moves anywhere other than directly over the base of support, gravity wants to keep pulling it in that direction even more and even more. Right? That's part of why babies they don't just come walking out of the womb. It takes a certain level of strength and coordination to be able to walk because we're constantly balancing our center of mass over our base of support, which is our feet in the case of walking. And then we go and we decide to strap skis to our feet, and suddenly turn forces and terrain are knocking us all over the place, and it adds even more challenge to that equation. A couple quick terms before we jump back into our game here, right? Just so I want to distinguish between force and pressure. A force is just a push or a pull that acts on us, pushing or pulling us in a direction. It's things like gravity, which is always pulling us down into Earth. But the thing about forces, though, is we can't do a whole lot about them, right? Gravity just kind of exists whether we want it to or not. But pressure, on the other hand, is something we can kind of control, right? Pressure is simply a force distributed over a given area. And while we can't do a whole lot about the forces acting upon us, we can direct those forces, right? And so that first main force we have to deal with is gravity. But for the technically minded out there, I know gravity isn't technically a force, right? We deal with forces like our weight, also known as the disappointing number we stare at on our bathroom scales, which is a result of gravity acting upon our mass. But for the sake of simplicity, when you hear me talk about gravity, I'm referring to the force as a result of gravity accelerating us into this giant rock we call Earth. And so we can direct this force and change the resulting pressure, whether it's in the vertical plane or side to side, or as we'll start off, fore and aft. So back to our game. We know a bit more about the challenge of our game now, right? And that's maintaining balance, right? Keeping that center of mass balanced relative to our base of support. And so here's how to control the skier in our game. And so we've got our skier here. And normally when we're not moving and we're standing still, we balance that center of mass directly over the base of support. But we can also move it. If we push our joystick up, it moves the center of mass forward. If we pull the joystick back, it moves our center of mass back. So what's the point? Gravity is always pulling down on our mass. And when I'm standing on flat ground, not moving, with my center of mass above my base of support, that pressure gets directed pretty evenly along the length of my skis. But if I press forward on that joystick and shift that center of mass forward, so too does that pressure along the length of my ski. The tips get a little bit heavier feeling, and the tails get a little bit lighter. See the shift there. And likewise, if we pull back on the joystick, shifting our center of mass back, the pressure shifts more towards the tails of our skis. So one of the characters in our game is Pete. And Pete's pulling back on his joystick here, shifting his center of mass backwards. You can see the pressure directed so far back towards the tails that his tips actually begin to rise up, clearly showing there's not really any pressure on his tips considering they're in the air. But Pete can also push his joystick forward and direct the pressure towards his tips. And while the length of our skis can make up for us being a bit too far forward or a bit too far back most of the time, we can still go a little bit too far. You know, Pete probably should have stopped pushing forward on his joystick, but Pete takes chances he shouldn't sometimes. And sometimes Pete ends up with his base of support over his center of mass. So we're going to enter the first level of our game, the half-pipe challenge. The half-pipe seems simple, but it's a challenge that ends the bravest of heroes. A challenge where if you don't get yourself perpendicular to the pipe surface to balance yourself, well, bad things happen, especially on rollerblades. Don't worry, it's all right. But if you pay attention to what happens, he starts strong, leaning forward at the top deck, but very quickly he stops moving forward, and his base of support starts to move faster than his center of mass. He doesn't lean forward quick enough and to get perpendicular with the pipe slope. And ultimately, he never quite gets his center of mass to catch up, and well, the rest was history. So Pete's respawned, and he's up for another challenge. So if somebody could answer, what direction does Pete need to push his joystick in order to do better than our friend on the rollerblades when he drops into this pipe?
Forward.
Yeah, definitely, right? And Pete, Pete's a pretty high level character, and so of course he crushes it. If you draw a line between the center of his base of support and the center of mass, you can see his center of mass very quickly shift forward to maintain that perpendicular relationship with the slope as he drops in. And that helps him maintain balance and pressure along the length of his skis. This as opposed to our rollerblading friend, where his base of support takes off without him. And unlike with skis, where you may be able to get away with that, rollerblades don't have that long base of support to make up for it. But we all kind of know this problem as ski instructors, right? It's the pinnacle of teaching a beginner lesson. Getting your students to move with their skis, as opposed to having their skis start to slide down the hill while their center of mass kind of stays in place, and eventually they kind of end up falling backwards onto their butts. All right? But now back to Pete here. Now that he's dropped in, the pitch then begins to reduce, right? It goes from a steep pitch at the top to starting to level out, and now it's starting to kind of push the snow is starting to push his tips back up at him. And to compensate, that center of mass needs to begin shifting back again to maintain balance and pressure. So the slope you are skiing down may be a constant pitch, though any friends here from Okemo knows that's a bit of a idealistic pipe dream in the rolling hills of Okemo. But as you turn down the hill and back across, the slope pitch is kind of constantly changing relative to you. If you think about how we all stand when we stop and take a break partway down a ski slope, we stand with our skis across the hill because it's effortless to stay still. And it's a lot like just standing on flat ground, right? We don't usually stop with our skis pointed down the hill because we're fighting gravity and it's kind of standing at an awkward angle. We turn in skiing because it takes us out of the pitch and allows us to slow down. But through that process, we go through a change of pitch, increasing relative to us as we turn down the hill, and then that pitch kind of decreases and falls off again as we turn back across the hill. And if you're having a hard time visualizing this, don't worry. I got you covered. We're going to break this down into kind of two phases. The first is the top half of the turn, where you're going from your skis turned across the hill to turning your skis down the hill into the fall line. As you start turning your skis down the hill begins basically kind of like tilting away from you. And much like when Pete had to move his center of mass forward to drop into the half pipe, the center of mass needs to move forward to match the pitch of the slope and keep pressure on the tips of the skis. Unlike the half pipe, a normal turn down the hill is a much more gradual pitch change, right? It's not going to usually require as much or as quick of a move forward with the center of mass as it did in the half pipe, where it was that sharp drop in. Whereas this is more of a slow fall off as you turn down the hill. But the reality of what we usually see in our students, and sometimes ourselves, is that the slope falls away, and the center of mass doesn't move as much as it needs to, or at all. So instead of staying in balance and keeping pressure distributed in an effective way, we end up with our center of mass behind our base of support and creating a lot of tail pressure. And what happens is when we end up with a lot of tail pressure at this top phase of the turn, it's hard to get the skis to effectively turn down the hill, right? The tail pressure inhibits the ability for the skis to skid, and thus we end up resorting to things like stemming and pushing the skis out and away from us. But then, when we look at the second half of the turn, the opposite's happening, right? As we turn out of the pitch of the hill and back across the hill is now no longer falling away from us, but it's actually coming back towards us as the pitch, relative to us, begins to flatten back out. So now that we've moved our center of mass forward relative to our base of support in the first half of the turn, we now need to move that center of mass back again to compensate for the hill flattening out. Right? Very much like when Pete made a big move to drop forward into the half pipe, he then had to move back again as the half pipe flattened out. So ideally, as we turn back across the hill, the center of mass shifts back to match that reducing pitch of the hill. But again, the real versus ideal, often what we see is the center of mass again tends to remain a little bit more stagnant, right? With the slope reducing, it's now kind of pushing the tips of my skis back up to me and closer to my center of mass. And the pressure then shifts towards the tips of my skis if that center of mass does not move backwards to match it. Right? And in our beginner students, this often materializes as the tails washing out, especially when they're transitioning out of a wedge to parallel, right? We've all seen it where our students, we get our students maybe like breaking their wedge, they're starting to work towards parallel and turning across the hill. And next thing you know, they make that turn and their tails wash out and they end up spinning around backwards and moving and end up out of control, sliding backwards down the hill. We get so on them about, front of your boots, feel the shin pressure, and that'll definitely help them get their turn started. But if you see the tails washing out, that's often a sign that there's too much tip pressure and not enough tail pressure. And to be perfectly honest, this is a problem I see propagate with some of the really good skiers in the country. They just get way better at hiding it. But what it robs them of is since there's already so far forward, they have nowhere to go from there than back. And so they can't move forward any farther as they begin their new turn. So they end up moving back during the phase of the turn where they should be moving forward, and it robs them of ski performance in the top halves of their turn. An important note here is that this is usually, and I'm not going to say never, but it's usually a smooth and continuous movement, right? A lot of people think that, think of fore and aft movement as like, I need to slam forward into the front of my boots at the top of my turn. And that was something I was super guilty of for a long time. It was Sue Kramer, I think it was, called my skiing porpoise-like, like as in a dolphin, like years back, because that's what my skiing looked like. I would go from aft at the end of my turns to just suddenly slamming into the front of my boots at turn initiation. And the problem with that is like I said, once you hit that end of your range of motion, moving forward, there's nowhere else to go but back. Aside from that, though, this smooth and continuous thought process doesn't just apply to fore and aft movement. It's very relevant to most skiing skills. So we're going to enter level 2 of our game. As with most games, as you progress through the levels, the games tend to get a little bit more challenging as you figure out how to play the game. And on top of fore and aft, now we're going to start thinking about lateral movement and balance as well. And hopefully someday I aspire to be as good at lateral movement as this skierless ski arcing it down the hill. By the way, I just can't imagine what yard sale had to have happened uphill for a ski to come down with a boot still in it without the skier. So right, in level 1, we spent most of our time in the fore-aft world where we mainly dealt with gravity. But in level 2, we now also have to deal with inertia. And it's not technically the correct term, but it's very commonly referred to as centrifugal force. And there's some, physics nerds who care passionately about the subject and say centrifugal force doesn't exist. But centrifugal force is not to be confused with centripetal force. which is an actual part of ski physics and part of that equal and opposite reaction of Newton's laws. And speaking of Newton's laws, I don't want to get too far in the nerd realm here any more than we already have, but there's a piece of Newton's first law I kind of wanted to highlight that I thought it was interesting. And it reads, an object remains at rest or continues to move in a straight line at a constant speed if there are no unbalanced forces acting upon it, right? And that important part there is that it wants to continue to move in a straight line at a constant speed, but we turn a lot in skiing, right? Unless you ski with my clients, and I know Rolf and Linda will know who I'm talking about. And so thus we have to deal with this thing called inertia. When we point our skis down a hill and we start moving, like inertia wants us to keep moving at that speed in that direction. The second we try to turn, our inertia wants to keep pulling us in the direction that we were going. And that pull towards the direction that we were going is the pull we feel towards the outside of the turn when we turn on skis. Or if you make a sharp turn in a car and you smack your head off the window. The key piece here is the magnitude or the amount of force that's pulling us to the outside of the turn is proportional to the rate of direction change. If I'm going straight down a hill with no direction change, there is nothing pulling me laterally. But if I start to make small direction changes, right? Think like maybe shallow railroad tracks or just lazy little turns. There's a little bit of force pulling me to the outside, but not a lot. But if I'm making super high edge angle turns where I'm bending the crap out of my ski and changing directions very quickly, I have a lot of force pulling me to the outside of the turn. And most people, when you talk about center of mass relative to base of support, tend to think about fore and aft movement. But I think of that relationship between the two in all three dimensions, right? And lateral balance is no exception. Looking at these pictures here on the right, in the top photo, I gently hopped sideways, right? I'm going from moving at a very gentle speed sideways to a stop. And there's not a huge amount of direction change going on, so the resulting force due to inertia isn't that strong. Nevertheless, I still have to kind of move my center of mass slightly inside my base of support, which is my foot in this case, to balance against that small force due to inertia. In the bottom photo, I jump sideways much harder, right? And because of this, going from moving much faster to a stop, the resulting force due to inertia is much higher. And because of that, the amount my center of mass moves inside relative to my base of support is much higher so that I can balance against the much higher force, right? In other words, my foot is able to move much farther out from underneath me to maintain my balance when I jumped harder. So how about we see that in motion? In the smaller, this is the smaller, gentler lateral jump. And you can see that my landing foot, my base of support, it's slightly out from underneath my center of mass to balance, but not a lot. And this is the much larger, more forceful jump. And it's much more force of it is partially indicated by the earth shaking upon my landing. But you can see how I travel a farther distance because I'm pushing off farther. And then when I land, I go from moving much faster to coming to a stop. And so there's a much greater direction change going on when that happens. And for visual clarity, here they are overlaid over top of each other, right? The center of mass ends up virtually in the same place, which was just complete luck of the draw on my part and made my video editing life much easier. But underneath, you can see the difference in where my base of support, aka my foot, lands. Right? Because there's much more force due to inertia pulling me laterally in the harder jump, the base of support has to come farther out from underneath me to maintain balance upon landing. And here's the side-by-side, right? In the left picture, I'm only pushing my joystick slightly to the side, whereas in the right picture, when I jumped harder, I have to push it farther to maintain that balance. So then what happens if I jump gently, like the first video, but I move my base of support out from underneath me, like the second video. And what happens is I fall inside, right? There's not enough lateral force to balance against for how much I move my base of support out from underneath of me. And so what happens is all of my weight ends up on my inside foot. Ending up on my inside foot. That sounds like something we run into skiing all the time, isn't it? Right, in skiing, we can only move our center of mass to the inside of the turn as far as the forces due to inertia allow us. If we move inside too far or too quickly, we end up out of balance on our inside foot. And sort of like how like the length of our skis allows us to get away with poor fore-aft balance, having 2 feet kind of allows us to get away with a lot of lateral balance issues too, right? That's the challenge of tasks like outside ski turns or one ski skiing, where you really have to nail the accuracy of how much you move your center of mass inside the turn to stay balanced over that ski without relying on the other ski that you picked up. And because of this relationship where the center of mass always moves inside of the base of support to maintain balance during a turn, they always take 2 different pathways, where the base of support always takes a wider path, whereas the center of mass always takes the inside path, right? And those paths ideally look a lot like the figure on the right, with the red line representing the path of the center of mass as it travels down the hill, and the blue path representing the base of support. The apex of a turn is that deep belly in the middle where the paths diverge the most. Sometimes the apex is in the fall line, the part of the turn where your skis are pointed straight down the hill, but not always, right? But the apex is typically where the most direction change happens. It's the middle of the shaping phase of a turn. And as we mentioned earlier, the more direction change, the more force pulling us to the outside due to inertia. Thus, that is why that's the point where the path of the center of mass diverges the most from the path of the base of support. Right, and that's to help us maintain balance against the that peak force pulling us to the outside of the turn, where the most direction change is happening. I really love this video of Ted Ligety where you can see this in action. You can see the path of the center of mass, which stays pretty close to the middle of the video frame, whereas his base of support, his skis, swing out and away from him before they're steered back underneath him and they cross over again. Right, so this new challenge that we're facing in our game is that we're not only dealing with the force of gravity, we're also dealing with inertia now. And these arrows not only represent the direction the force is pulling us, but the length of that arrow represents the amount or the magnitude of the force pulling on us, right? The smaller arrow represents less force, while a longer arrow represents more force. And we don't need to attach numbers to those, but understand that if one arrow is longer than the other, it just means it's pulling us more than the other arrow. So if we were to visually add these together, we've got gravity pulling us down here, the downward arrow, and we have inertia pulling us outwards. And if we were to add them together, we end up with this diagonal line between those 2 arrows that represents the combined force of both gravity and inertia. So before, when we were just thinking about balancing against inertia, we were just focusing on moving our center of mass inside of our base of support, proportionally to the force inertia was placing on us. But now we're going to combine the forces as a result of both gravity and inertia as we work our way through a turn. And right, so at turn transition, we're on flat skis, right? There's not a lot of turning going on when we're on flat skis. And so there's not a lot of direction change happening. The only force I'm really dealing with is gravity, the one red arrow you can see on the screen right now. But as I start to turn down the hill, right, as we talked about in the first level, I have to move my center of mass forward as my skis move down or as my skis turn down the hill. But I also have to move my center of mass to the inside as that inertia begins to build because we're starting to turn, right? Effectively, the center of mass needs to move diagonally. So I'm going to push that joystick diagonally slightly. But as the turn develops, the force from gravity doesn't really change, but I'm still turning down the hill more, so I need to keep that center of mass moving forward. However, the force from inertia is increasing, right? The amount of direction change is starting to build. So that force from inertia is building as well. So I need to move that center of mass inside more. Thus, I push our joystick diagonally even farther. But then I hit that apex. And this is the point my center of mass is as far forward and as far inside the turn as I'm probably going to want it. And this is kind of the mistake most people fall into, the trap most people fall into. They continue to move inside to maybe try and get that super high edge angle carving visual they see in ski magazines. But this is the point where you want to start to let go and allow the path of your center of mass to start converging back with the base of support. And if we do that, the amount of direction change begins to reduce, and the force due to inertia begins to reduce as well. I'm moving my center of mass back closer to my base of support laterally, while also starting to shift that center of mass back, as we talked about in the first level, as I turn out of the pitch. And as we continue on, until we're back at turn transition, back to my flat skis with my center of mass over my base of support at turn transition. And that'll continue on into the next turn, where the inertia builds, and then reduces. When we add those forces together, ideally, that resulting diagonal line lines up with our base of support usually being the outside ski. You can see in this photo here, the snow spray shows where the majority of my pressure is, right? There's a lot of snow spray coming off my outside ski. So in this case, the majority of my snow spray, since it's coming off my outside ski, confirms that I've aligned that diagonal force line over my outside ski. But what if it doesn't? If we were to ignore the snow spray here for a second and pretend like I had less force of inertia, say I was making a slower turn, or less of a turn, I had less force of inertia pulling me to the outside of the turn, as represented by this smaller line, that diagonal line shifts, right? So we went from here to it moving in more. And so if I move my center of mass to the inside of the turn the same as before, but now with less force due to inertia, you can see that the diagonal line would end up lining up over my inside ski. Or worse, maybe it goes even farther in than that. And that's how we end up falling over under our hip, right? Because now the force is being directed farther inside than what our outside ski is. I'm not sure how many of you have read through the technical manual or not, but this concept is very closely related to the line of action term from the PSIA manual. It's a term I hear brought up a lot, but I don't know how many people actually know what it is, right? It's on the last page of the physics chapter in the Alpine Technical Manual, but the general idea being that with the line of action representing the combined forces of both gravity and inertia, that line ideally passes through both the inside edge of your outside ski and your center of mass. These are screenshots from a video of Ted Ligety, and I think it's Kaylin Richardson ripping down the slope. And as you can see that, proportionally speaking, the magnitude of the force due to inertia is far greater than that of gravity, right? And this proportion difference is what allows him to move his center of mass as far inside as he does to get his hand and hip on the ground. Because there's so much inertia pulling him to the outside, that diagonal line ends up so far to the outside that he's able to move his center of mass in far enough to achieve these levels of edge angles. So we've been talking about the ideal, and what I will say is this is very far into the ideal realm. This is a skill that the best skiers in the world are always working on refining. And the challenge to this ideal is actually getting this crossover of the base of support, or I'm sorry, the crossover of the center of mass over the base of support to happen when this illustration shows. Transition occurs when you're able to get off your old edges and flatten your skis, right? To flatten your skis, though, that means you need to be perpendicular with the pitch of the hill. In other words, if you draw that line through the base of support and your center of mass, that line needs to be perpendicular to the slope. But it gets kind of worse, right? To then get on your new edges, you actually have to be physically downhill from your skis. And on flatter terrain, that's not quite as hard to commit to, especially for more experienced skiers. But on a much steeper slope, it starts looking more and more like trying to drop into that half pipe sideways, right? And it takes a serious amount of commitment to be able to get your center of mass downhill from your base of support on steep pitches. A lot of people get stuck standing the way these trees grow. So when this doesn't happen, right, this ideal, the path of our center of mass, as well as the ski tracks we leave in the snow, go from looking like the ideal figures on the left side to looking more like the paths and tracks on the right side here. You can tell a lot about a skier by paying attention to either the path of their center of mass relative to their base of support or the tracks that they leave in the snow. The pathways on the right tell me a skier is doing one or more of a number of things, right? Maybe they're not moving forward enough at the top of the turn here, so it keeps them from steering through the top of the turn. Or maybe they're holding on to the turn for too long as they finish the turn, and they end up finishing that turn too far back and too far to the inside, so that the bottom gets drug out. Maybe they're rushing the top half of the turn, and they get bottom heavy as they finish the turn. They have to drag out the bottom of the turn to slow down and control their speed, right? There's a lot of different reasons. That's not an all-inclusive list, but oftentimes they're kind of related to one another. But if you pay attention to the path of the center of mass versus the base of support, or you watch the tracks that your students leave in the snow, that can lead you down a path to solving many of the issues we deal with in our students, right? Even Pete Novom. For those who don't know him, he's our training manager at Okemo, who just made the national team. And he towards the end of last season asked me to give him some feedback on a task we were doing. And the feedback that I gave him was directly framed in the context of the path his center of mass was taking relative to his base of support. Right? So whether you're looking at more beginner skiers, you're looking at some of the best skiers we've got on the East Coast, there's a very wide range of skill levels looking through this lens can work on. One last little fun example before we begin to wrap up this section on physics. The parallel I've been trying to draw here tonight with the joystick analogy, if you haven't picked up on it yet, is that we, as in our bodies and our center of mass, are the joysticks controlling our skis. Our skis only do what they're told, usually. Sometimes it's nice to blame the equipment. But what we do with our bodies and the relationship between our center of mass and base of support directly influences what our skis do. And in the case of whirlybirds, you can easily see how my center of mass here moves relative to my base of support to get the skis to spin. Right? So just like the joystick goes in a circle, so too does my center of mass around my base of support. And that causes the skis to spin around in the way that they do. One more time so you can see, center of mass moves forward and inside, but then as the skis come around, the center of mass moves back, and there's a constant adjustment of the center of mass basically spinning around my base of support, and that creates these rotational forces. Because it's not leg steering in a whirlybird. One more quick force, and I'm going to gloss over this for the sake of time. It relates to that last fundamental, right? That regulating the magnitude of pressure between the ski and snow interaction, aka managing pressure in the vertical plane, as opposed to fore and aft or lateral like we've been focusing on. And we talked about how modern joysticks can be pressed down like a button, right? Well, so too can our center of mass and our base of support be moved closer together through leg flexion or farther apart through leg extension. The most common example of this, of course, being moguls or variable chopped up terrain, right? Where you can choose to flex to absorb it, like in the left video here, right? You can see the center of mass and the base of support quickly converge to absorb that bump, or don't, like on the right here, and you can go airborne. So, skiing is simply a game of balancing against constantly changing forces knocking us around. Right, we have to deal with gravity, inertia, and the snow pushing back at us and make adjustments to maintain our balance. Right, but like I said, we are the controllers to our skis. The relationship of our center of mass relative to our base of support directly dictates how our skis perform. And not just like the fore and aft relationship we always think about, but laterally and vertically as well, right? But there are two caveats here that I would like to mention. Right? So the joystick analogy that I've come up with may make it sound like the center of mass only moves over the base of support. But the base of support can also be moved under the center of mass, while the center of mass kind of stays fixed and the base of support just kind of moves under it. Or some combination of the two, right? Maybe one's moving forward while the other's moving back. And while the way I kind of discussed fore and aft pressure in these examples may make it sound like distributing pressure evenly along the length of your skis is the desired outcome. That's not always the end goal, right? There are many scenarios where being more tip heavy or tail heavy can be ideal. And like the whirlybird is an example of where you can use uneven ski pressure to help create rotational forces. So if physics is the why we do what we do in skiing, biomechanics is the how. This is a topic I will not be covering tonight, but I wanted to mention it just kind of as a suggestion of something you should potentially know if you're going for an assessment or just want to better understand body movements. But planes of motion is something covered in the technical manual, and it could theoretically be something that comes up in an assessment. I covered it in our last webinar back in May, which was on off-season snow sports training. And I will detail how to find that recording at the end of this presentation. But I do cover this planes of motion concept in pretty good detail. And I not only describe what the planes of motions are in that webinar, but I relate them to the skills concept, like which skills concepts exist in which planes of motion, as well as ideas for covering how to train your body in those planes of motion in the off season, so you can come in the next season swinging. So I have a question for everyone, and if you've come to a clinic with me on snow before, there's probably a decent chance you've heard me pose this question before. But it's one of my favorite questions to kind of provoke some thought about biomechanics. If I were to ask you what part of your body, or maybe what joint does leg rotation originate in, what would it be?
Hip.
The hip socket, right? The femur head rotating in the hip socket, right? The leg rotates in the hip socket, and that theoretically produces leg steering. But then what joint does the motion of knee angulation originate in, right? In other words, what causes the angle you can see in my knees between my upper and lower leg? Because we know our knees don't bend sideways, at least normally they don't. So what body movement or what joint is actually causing that knee angulation to happen?
Yep.
Yeah, it's the same place. It originates mostly from the same place. It's that rotation of the femur head inside the hip socket. But what differentiates these two, right? If they both come from rotation of the femur and the hip socket, they can't both come from the same thing and produce two different results, right? One's steering, one's edging, without some other variable coming into play. So we're going to start our discussion on biomechanics, kind of starting from the ground up.
So the ankles are one of the biggest sources of accurate and smooth movements in skiing, right? The whole ankle, foot, lower leg complex is a pretty complicated structure, but you really don't need to know the nitty-gritty to understand most of it. So the ankle and foot complex is capable of a few different movements, and we're going to be focusing on a couple of them as they pertain to skiing. The first one is probably the obvious one, and that's ankle flexion and extension, right? And for whatever reason, some probably pretty smart person decided that instead of calling the opening and closing of the ankle flexion and extension like every other joint in the body, we're going to call it dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, right? For some reason, closing your ankle is called dorsiflexion, while opening your ankle is called plantar flexion. And the worst part about this that drives me kind of insane is that dorsiflexion is one word and plantar flexion is two words. Why, right? Why do we need to overcomplicate this? So you may hear me say like dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, but for the sake of simplicity, I may also say ankle flexion and extension, right? Where flexion is the same as dorsiflexion and extension is the same as plantar flexion. And just to make sure we're clear on this, here's a visual example. On the left here, we have dorsiflexion, right? Where the foot is taken from a neutral position and the angle between the foot and the shin is reduced. The toes are brought closer to the shin, right? And this red triangle kind of represents the range of motion that I'm demonstrating in that movement. On the right is plantar flexion, or as I said, I'll sometimes just refer to it as ankle extension, where the foot is taken from a neutral position and the angle between the foot and the shin is increased. Right? So that was with my foot in the air, though. What if my foot is fixed to the ground, much like in skiing, and the shin moves around it? Well, then it looks kind of something like this. The ankle starts in an open position, and I move through that range of motion into a flexed position. And if you guess this has a lot to do with fore and aft balance, yeah, you'd be right. But I think this is actually one of the least interesting things that the ankle does, which brings us to our next ankle movement. And that is the rolling of the feet and ankles. And again, my verbiage of rolling is a simplified version. In biomechanics, we refer to this as pronation and supination, right? Like dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, the words aren't nearly as important as knowing how the ankles actually move and affect your ski performance. I've never been a stickler for words. I just like to make sure we communicate ideas. And so don't stress about memorizing those words, but they are handy to know. An important piece of this, though, is that pronation and supination are actually a combination of several movements. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm not going to go into detail on this. If you want to know, it's in the technical manual in the biomechanics chapter. Just because in reality, you probably don't need to know that pronation is a combination of dorsiflexion, eversion, and abduction, right? Those movements are kind of difficult to separate and do separately anyway, and we use them as one combined movement in skiing most of the time anyway. Oh, that's a good point, David. David Kirk in the chat said, I remember as plantar flexion because toes down. Plantar flexion is toes down because you're planting the toes in the ground. Yeah, that's a good cue to remember it. So unlike dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, which kind of operate only in one plane of motion, right, fore and aft, pronation and supination, being a little bit more complicated of a combination of movements, causes them to actually occur in all three dimensions or planes of motion. I'll show you what you mean in a second, but as I show you these visually, this is why I'll be kind of showing them from two different angles. So we'll start with pronation, right? And when we look from the side angle here on the left, we can see that the foot kind of rolls inward and it kind of rolls inward onto that inside edge of the foot. Whereas when we look from the front, you can actually see that the foot actually rotates outward and away from the inside of the foot, right? This is this combination of movements coming into play. So understanding that not only is there a rolling towards the edge of the foot in pronation, but that there's also a rotational movement as well is critical, right? This is going to be a huge role in understanding, or a huge part of understanding the ankle's role in skiing here, right? And so again, I'm going to take this movement to the floor, where the foot will stay still and the rest of the body moves around it. You can see as the foot pronates and rolls, the foot tilts inwards while the other side of the foot lifts up. So going back to our discussion on pressure, you can see that the inside of the foot gets heavy while the outside of the foot gets kind of light. So we are distributing pressure along the width of our foot using this movement. And this will be important in a little bit. But that rotation piece comes up again. So while the foot doesn't rotate while it's planted on the floor, pay attention to the shin. You can clearly kind of see it rotating back and forth, and it rotates inward here as the foot pronates and rolls inward itself. But there's also a little bit of a lateral movement and a tipping of the shin going on up here. You can kind of see at the top edge of the frame how the shin moves a little bit laterally as this pronation happens. Supination, it's the opposite of pronation, right? With supination, you can see the foot rolling towards the outside edge of the foot, while the toes of the foot rotate inwards now instead of outwards like in pronation. And if we plant our foot on the floor, we can see that rolling towards the outside edge of the foot. And so again, we're changing where the pressure is distributed along the width of our foot. But again, we can also see that rotation of the shin happening again, right? Now as the foot rolls outwards, so does the shin. The shin kind of rotates outwards while tipping outwards as well, right? So it's the opposite of pronation. In skiing, we tend to roll both feet in the same direction though, right? In other words, we pronate one foot while supinating the other. In this video on the right, we can see that where both feet roll one direction to end up on the same side edges of the foot, and then they both roll the other direction and end up on the opposite same side edges of the foot. And I would actually encourage you all to give that a try, right? Like stand up and just try rolling your feet onto the edges, right? And feel how the pressure changes along the width of your foot, right? Because as we'll discuss shortly, that lateral pressure change is only going to be, it's going to be pretty core to how this actually affects the edging of your skis. Right? As I roll my feet to the left, I can feel the pressure on the left edges. As I roll my feet to the right, I can feel the pressure on the right edges of my foot. But when we do this, something interesting happens. Can you all start to see something resembling knee angulation going on here? Right? We're starting to create those angles in the knees without my knees actually bending sideways. Not only do the lower legs here rotate and tip as we pronate and supinate, but the upper legs rotate as well, right? AKA that rotation of the femur in the hip socket. And you can kind of see it indicated by my knees here. As my upper legs rotate, my knees kind of change direction. And so these movements, they're all very heavily intertwined with each other. Oh, yeah. There's my comparison to knee angulation I forgot about. So back to our question from earlier. What differentiates leg steering and knee angulation when they both involve rotation of the femur in the hip socket? The difference all comes down to the lower leg and what the foot and the ankle are doing. In the left video, you can see that the upper leg rotates more than the foot, right? As indicated by my knee here, the foot always kind of stays pointed forward while my upper leg rotates and changes direction. It changes the direction of my knee. And so when it does that, it results in the foot tipping and rolling. In the right video, though, the upper leg is still rotating just as it is in the left video, but now the foot matches its rotation. And we can clearly see the foot also staying flat along with steering. Instead of rolling and making more of an edging movement like on the left here. We tend to bang the drum on leg steering in ski instruction constantly, right? We always talk about that rotation of the femur head in the hip socket, but what I don't feel like we talk about remotely enough is lower leg rotation. Right? It's like as you're sitting here in a chair or whatever, the couch or whatever, and you're listening to this webinar, just try turning your feet without turning your upper legs. When you're sitting with your legs bent, it's really easy to highlight how the foot and the lower leg can rotate separately from the upper leg. It's also really easy to do on a chairlift with your skis on. You may even be able to feel the muscles of your lower leg kind of engaging as you rotate that foot. But the differentiating factor between what takes upper leg rotation and changes it between leg steering and knee angulation ultimately comes down, at least in part, to what the lower leg does. Upper leg rotation without the foot following produces edging outcomes, like you can see in the left video. Upper leg rotation with lower leg rotation produces steering outcomes. And lower leg rotation basically effectively works as an anti-edging movement. So when we translate this to inside a ski boot and on a ski, we can see the edging outcome that it produces, right? The same pronation and supination movement we've been talking about, the same upper leg rotation, rotating more than my foot movement. It all translates to a very accurate, effortless, and finesse-based edging movement of my skis. One that doesn't require big moves from higher up in the body to tip my skis. And yes, I cut open a boot to show you this. An interesting, I think, takeaway from this that you can apply to your beginner lessons, and it's at least it's a scenario I've ran into. But one thing I've experienced personally when trying to teach like wedge level beginners how to use more leg rotation is that sometimes when they try to steer with their legs, they turn the upper leg, but what they actually end up doing is tipping their ski on a higher edge angle, right? And it ends up like a railroad tracking the ski instead of skidding it and steering it more. And that's because while they are rotating their upper leg, just like I asked, they're not rotating their foot with it. There's no tension in that lower leg and active steering of the foot to match the rotation of the upper leg, right? So anytime I'm teaching leg steering, I usually grab their foot and have them twist it in my hand to get the feeling of steering with their feet too. So that way, their leg steering keeps their lower leg steering keeps a lower, skiddier edge angle rather than tipping more on edge like we can see in this video. Another interesting note is how your boot fitting can actually affect this, right? Pay attention to my ankle in this video as I zoom in, right? My ankle is actually laterally moving inside my boot. We tend to think of like great fitting boots as just like smashing our foot into the tightest possible boot that we can squeeze it into, right? But that's not actually the case. While you want a tight fit in some parts of your boots, in others you need room for your foot to actually move. When you're pronating, your arch tends to collapse, while in supination, your arch tends to rise. And that, combined with this lateral movement of the ankle going on in here, right, boop, that helps the foot roll and produce these edging movements. But if your foot is so jammed up and your arch or your ankle can't move at all inside your boot, it restricts your ability to perform these movements. So, funny enough, a really common question I get is why I ski on such narrow skis all the time. The reason is that ski width actually also plays a role on the effect of this tipping movement. In the left video, I'm on a 68 underfoot ski, while on the right, I'm on an 87 underfoot ski. And you can see how the same movement produces different results based on the ski width, right? It kind of looks like the right video is just paused, But if you take a close look, you can still see my ankle moving, and you can still see some of the muscles twitching as I try to tip the ski. But on the wider ski, the ski doesn't tip onto the edge like the narrow ski. Why is that? So I made a wood model to represent our ski and the base of our boots that our feet rest on. Right? The bottom board down here represents our ski, where the top board is the base of our boot. We talked earlier about how pronation, supination changes where the pressure gets distributed along the width of our foot, right? And that's where this comes into play. If I direct a force anywhere in the middle of my boot base, such as when my foot is resting in a neutral position, the ski just kind of wants to lay flat, right? And as long as I'm pressuring the base of my boot, and the majority of that pressure is directed somewhere above the width of my ski that's underneath my boot base, the ski will be flat, assuming you're not like leveraging on the side of your boot or using some other method of edging. However, the second I direct pressure by pronating or supinating towards the edges of my feet and past the edge of my ski, we create something called a moment arm, and that leverages the ski into wanting to tip on edge. The ski wants to edge now just by changing where we pressure along the width of our foot. No big body movements, no big muscular effort. It's just a rolling and tipping of the foot, changing where the pressure is on the base of your boot board. Right? And this causes the ski to edge effortlessly. Same thing on the other side here, right? For the example I'm using my finger to create the force. And the red arrow represents that force, right? And the dotted line representing where the edge of my ski is in relation to the base of my boot. This little dotted line right here. All right, so if I roll my foot and it directs pressure past the edge of my ski, and the ski wants to now edge because of it. And so this is exactly what's going on in the video with my foot in the boot. Rolling from side to side, causing the ski to tip on edge. But there's a key point here I want you to notice, though, as it relates to the width of the base of your boot relative to the width of your ski. I will justify wider skis in a second here, too. Don't worry. But as it relates to like the width of the base of your boot relative to the width of your ski, and your boot base is likely a similar width to your forefoot. This is only possible, this tipping motion, because my forefoot and the base of my boot are wider than the width of my ski. And that allows me to direct my pressure past the edge of my ski. So what if my ski is wider than my foot and my boot? Well, now it looks something like this, right? Where the boot base sits on top of the ski, but the ski edges extend past the widest parts of my boot base and my foot. Now, no matter where I apply the force along the width of my boot base, using the pronation, the tipping of the foot that we talked about, now the ski just wants to be flat all the time, right? Even if I lift the board up onto the edge, no matter where I place pressure along the width of the boot board, you can see that force wanting to push that ski flat. Two really important points on this, just to be completely fair. This assumes the firm conditions we typically ski on in the East Coast, right? When the snow is firm, the pivot point of the ski is around the edges, right? But when the snow is softer, that ski penetrates into the snow farther. And now that pivot point moves more underfoot past the edge of the ski, depending on how soft the snow is. And so, like, as my dad liked to mentioned in the comments down there, yes, I do have a pair of 109 centimeter skis. I haven't millimeter skis underfoot that I haven't skied on in quite a while. It's usually my 87 underfoot now. And so I do own wider skis, and I do use them in softer conditions, right? Especially in things like soft spring slush, where on narrower skis, when I get the higher edge angles, they sink into the snow so much that my boots hit the snow, right? And so that's when I like a wider ski to help hold me out from underneath the snow, or in really deep powder. And the other piece of this is, depending on how you look at it, there can be advantages to this, though, right? Especially for like beginner or more intermediate skiers. If you have a hard time flattening your skis at the end of your turn, this desire for the ski to be flat no matter what is going to aid in that. It's going to make that transition from going from an edge ski at turn finish to a flat ski easier. And so this is one reason why like wider skis are often marketed as being more forgiving. But I'm sure you guys can see like though for like why tasks like railroad tracks or any kind of skiing that requires finer, more accurate tipping movements, as opposed to larger body movements, which can only like that becomes the only real way to edge a wider ski on firmer snow is larger body movements up higher in your body. But for those more precise edging type movements, narrower skis, at least on firmer snow, definitely have the advantage. It allows that pronation and supination of your foot to actually affect the edging of your skis more. So there's some limitations of the ankles though, and unfortunately, like they're not the solution to all of our problems. I have pretty good ankle mobility, but when I'm locked into a 150 flex race boot, that doesn't really matter. Right? Hard plastic shells limit our ankles' range of motion, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And it's not necessarily a bad thing because ultimately our ankles don't exactly have the strongest muscles attached to them. While our calves might be pretty strong, which can aid in things like resisting forces pulling you forward, like when you slam into a mogul. Most of the muscles, though, involved in things like flexing the ankle, like especially like things like dorsiflexion, they're not nearly as strong. If you look at this video on the right here, this is a kettlebell toe curl where I train my dorsiflexion in the gym. And I just upped that to 30 pounds, which I was able to do about 10 reps of. And for comparison's sake, like when I train my calves, I use more like 250 to 300-ish pounds for like 15 reps, right? There's a tremendous strength differential there. And expecting only our ankles to carry the brunt of our fore and aft movement does not make sense to me, right? We need something more. We need bigger and stronger muscles to help with that. But before we get there, one last quick note. Here's the start of your biomechanics toolbox, your practical takeaways you can add to your repertoire here. Right? The ankle gives us a starting point, accuracy, finesse of our lateral movements, right? And they help tip the skis on edge while starting to create angles in our body to help maintain outside ski pressure. But we know that while upper leg rotation is involved in both leg steering and knee angulation, rotation of the foot and the lower leg can help create more rotational-based steering outcomes, or a lack thereof can create more edging-based outcomes. Right? And while we know that the ankle is critical to fore and aft movement, there's also some limitations there, which we will be addressing in the next section here, along with things like flexion and extension to absorb things like moguls. So, you guys won't be, oh, actually, could you guys hear that? Okay, I did fix it then. Moving up the chain here, we have the last big piece we're going to cover tonight, and that's leg length change, right? In particular, flexion and extension of the knees and the hips, hip joints. And so very much in contrast to the ankles, particularly ankles locked into ski boots, the knees and hips provide far more range of motion than you'll ever need access to in skiing. Right? You can see in this video the huge range of motion that the knees and the hips provide. And as you might have deduced, either end of this range of motion, where you're either fully flexed or fully extended, is not typically a position you'll want to end up in. You're gonna have a bad time. And you'll just have to trust me on that, right? Because as someone who's I've managed to tear my calf muscle hitting a flat light mogul while in that fully extended position. It sucks. But but one thing that I think is maybe even more important when comparing to the ankles is that the muscles attached to the knees and hips, aka the glutes, the quads, the hamstrings, are some of the biggest and strongest muscles in the entire body. Unlike many of the ankle muscles, these joints give us access to a lot of strength and power. And a thing I always like to think about is, yes, the ankles are absolutely involved in fore and aft motion. However, how can I set my ankles up for success? Right? Because if I'm in a position like this, expecting those muscles I was curling a 30-pound kettlebell with to suddenly leverage 200 pounds of me forward into the front of my boots over and over and over every turn is not a recipe for success. So how do we support the ankle in fore and aft movement? Well, we bring in the big guns. So look at this sequence, right? You can see as I go from turn transition here in the first frame to turn entry, the top of my turn in the second frame, the knees and the hips are extending, creating forward movement of the center of mass. Right? But I actually think personally that this movement starts even earlier. Because if you're not thinking about forward movement until turn transition, it's probably too late. So let's add another frame here. Right? And so you can see the contrast in knee and hip position here, going from one turn apex where the inside leg is very flexed to just before the next turn apex where that same leg becomes far more extended. Right? And you can see how that moves the center of mass, which was back here before, way more forward relative to the base of support. And so in addition to supporting, or in addition to the support engaging these bigger muscles provides to the ankle, the shift of the center of mass forward, closer to being over the base of support or even in front of the base of support, reduces the amount of force leveraging backwards on my ankles. So it reduces the strain on those ankle muscles, which allows them to act in more of a stabilization role rather than trying to use them as a primary mover of the center of mass. And this movement, in my opinion, very, very closely resembles skating. Scott and I were having a discussion about this the other day, actually. I draw a lot of parallels to movements outside of skiing. And so you can see the parallels in position here, right? Having one leg extended while the other leg is flexed, ready to extend again and drive the center of mass forward, right? I got one leg extended, one leg flexed, just like the skaters. And I always say that when I'm feeling good skiing, it feels a lot like skating down the hill. And this is why, right? Anyone who's attended one of my clinics before knows how much I love to use skating drills. But even in beginner lessons, if you've got a nice flat area, teaching even like the most basic skating movements can be super beneficial to beginner skiers, right? It gives them a start and on the sensation of using their bigger muscles to drive their center of mass forward. So to me, it goes a little beyond just extension of the knee and the hip, right? I'm also like, what I feel when I do this is I'm actively driving that heel of my foot backwards into the back of my boot, right? And that brings that pulling back on my heel as I do this brings more of the glutes and the hamstring into that forward drive of the center of mass. And that helps again in relieving a lot of the stress on my ankle muscles to help hold me forward in the front of my boots, even when I'm in this very backseat looking position, like in the middle frame. But this movement is far more than just a fore and aft movement, right? Pay attention to that same camera side leg here that we've been highlighting. What else, in terms of the fundamentals, is being accomplished through this movement? Right? This same leg length change that's assisting in forward movement after the turn transition. It also is that same leg extension starts with the process of directing pressure from what was my old outside leg to what becomes my new outside leg. It also assists in my lateral movement that creates edge change, right? That extension of this leg moves my center of mass back over top of my skis and eventually on the other side of my base of support, right? And it also helps with that regulating the magnitude of pressure between the ski and snow fundamental. So with one movement, this extension of the knee and hip, we're checking off a lot of fundamentals boxes, right? Can we all see that? Scott, retraction, I wouldn't call this a retraction-based turn simply because I think of retraction as pure flexion-based movement. And so you can, if it was a retraction-based turn, at least my interpretation of it, I might not be correct here, but this leg wouldn't extend, right? The other leg, using just flexion of the other leg would be more of a retraction turn. But likewise, let's flip our attention to the other leg, and it's a little bit hard to see. I apologize. I was looking for a better angle to show this, but all of the videos I had featured a lot of shaking, and this was the most stable video I could find. But that far leg, the leg on the opposite side. So let's pay attention to what it's doing now, right? So as that far leg flexes, you can see how I go from, well, we'll back it up here. So right here, you can see how I go from pretty far forward on that ski to more of an aft position on its prior to turn transition, right? So that flexion of that knee and hip caused me to move aft at the end of my turn, which was one of those kind of desired goals we talked about in the physics section. Maybe not always this far aft, but I may have been a little bit too far back relative to the pitch and speed I was traveling at in this video. But generally speaking, it helps accomplish that aft movement we were looking for at the end of our turns. And then that leg flexion, that same leg flexion though, also begins to dial back the pressure on my outside ski and helps with that transfer of pressure to the new outside ski, that other leg. And additionally, we talked about this leg extending, helping move me down the hill. Well, also, that flexion of this far leg also helps move my center of mass down the hill, allowing the path of my center of mass to cross over the path of my base of support to create that edge change. And again, right, it's also helping absorb. We tend to get like a really pressure heavy at the bottom halves of our turns. And that flexion of that outside leg helps absorb some of that pressure that builds after the apex at turn finish instead of bracing against it, right? So we've got like opposing but complementary leg length change going on here that helps check off a lot of fundamental boxes. And so while the ankles give us a lot of our finesse and accuracy in lateral movements, leg length differences is what gives us the bulk of our lateral range of motion. You can see with Ted here, in one apex, his outside legs, knee and hip are very extended, while the inside legs, knee and hip are very flexed. And likewise, in the apex of the next turn, the new outside leg becomes more extended, while the inside leg is very flexed. Right, going from here to here. And while you don't need to be dragging your hand and hip on every turn, the essence of creating edge angles starts with the ankles, but continues with leg length differences. This is just kind of more of an extreme example to show you the full range of motion of which you can achieve pretty much primarily through leg length differentials. But the last kind of like important piece I want to touch on here tonight is this middle frame. Notice Ted's leg length at turn transition when he's on flat skis. His leg length is even. And this is an essential piece of good skiing. The ability to get to a flat ski by getting your legs to an even length. I said this earlier, but it's worth repeating back here in the biomechanics context. The only time we're on a flat ski is when our bodies are perpendicular with the hill. If you're just standing on the side of a slope, you're on an edge without even trying, right? When we're standing, we tend to stand the way the trees grow, like these trees in the background here, right? You can see the trees in the background being more upright compared to me, compared to my more perpendicular position to get to a flat ski. When we stand straight up, like the trees, without even trying, we're on our ski edges. I always like to say that the hardest part of skiing is not getting on your edges. It's getting off of them, and this is why, right? Ultimately, to get to that flat ski, you need to move your center of mass farther down the hill so you can get yourself perpendicular with the hill. And to get to that point, you need to get your legs to an even length. And there's no one way to achieve this. We talk about more extended transitions versus more flex transitions sometimes. And while I tend to be biased towards a more flexed position, there's a lot of really great skiers who use more extended transitions, and that's fine, right? The flexed versus extended transition topic is a whole nother wormhole for another time. So ultimately, it doesn't matter as much what your leg length is at transition to get to a flat ski. It's as long as they're the same length, regardless of if they're more flexed or extended. Although I will say, just as a teaching note here, despite being more personally biased towards flex transitions in my own skiing, where your more extended transitions, where your legs are longer, like Josh here on the right, and you're primarily using extension of the uphill leg to move that center of mass downhill, is generally easier. Flexed legs place more load on muscles rather than bones, while extended legs carry much more load through the bones as opposed to the muscles, right? So it's less fatiguing and a generally easier movement. So generally with less experienced skiers or maybe less athletic students, I may suggest a more extended leg transition than a flexed one. And so the issue we run into is this, right? This getting to a parallel position compared to the slope, especially on steep slopes, is really hard, right? Most skiers run into the issue of holding on to the end of their turns with a long leg for far too long, right? Their downhill leg stays more extended than their uphill leg. And that long downhill leg blocks the movement of their center of mass down the hill and prevents the crossover with the base of support. And that's how we get these weird center of mass and base of support pathways that we discussed earlier. Eventually, you or your students have to commit to actually moving that center of mass down the hill. And whether that's through more flexion of the downhill leg or more extension of the uphill leg, or, as I prefer, some combination of both, it doesn't really matter, right? You just need to get to an even leg length somehow as you finish your turn and transition to the new turn. Or in the case of teaching something like side slips, right? The thing I often hear is roll your feet, tip your ankles. And sometimes that works, especially when there's less pitch and you don't need to tip the skis as much to release the edges. But I often will see instructors on the side of a slope having holdups trying to teach side slips on steeper pitch because the ankles just don't flatten the skis enough to release the edges and create that side slip, right? Especially on those steeper pitches. The missing piece here is getting their students to actually just move their center of mass down the hill to achieve the flatter ski. And then this trend continues if we want to get on our new edges early, right? And it can be an intimidating thought, but if you want to get on your new edges early, you have to actually get your center of mass downhill from your skis, right? And that involves getting the new inside leg shorter than the outside leg. And the ability to do this, to me, is ultimately one of the hallmarks of higher level skiers. So we've expanded our toolbox, right? In addition to everything we added from ankle movements, now we've got these leg length movements to add to this. For lateral movements, we now know that leg length differences provide most of our lateral range of motion, right? With even leg length being the only real way to achieve flat skis between turns. Flexion and extension of the knees and hips provides both the most range of motion to move our center of mass fore and aft, but also involves the strongest muscles in our body, especially when compared to the ankle muscles. Flexion and extension of the knees in particular can have a huge impact on our relationship between our center of mass and base of support fore and aft-wise. Thanks for joining, Philip. And we kind of glossed over this. Don't worry, I'm wrapping up. Last slide. We kind of glossed over this a bit due to lack of time, but as you can probably imagine, these same knee and hip flexion and extension movements can be used for things like absorbing moguls, right? And then subsequently extending back into the troughs. right? Because while knee and hip extension can move us aft, generally speaking, you're going to want to be more aft anyway as you collide with a mogul, right? Because the force of that collision is going to throw you forward, and you need to move aft to balance against that, right? That's that blending of fundamentals we talked about. And likewise, as you come over the mogul and extend your legs down into the trough, you want to move forward to drive your tips down. And that same extension of the knees and hips shifts your center of mass forward conveniently. So with that, that's all I have tonight. My apologies on this running a little longer than usual. As you can imagine, we could probably dig way deeper into these topics, and we may have to revisit them in the future. But I realized after I had committed to tonight's topic and was finishing it up, this probably should have been a two-parter. But alas, I committed to it, and this is what we got. So if you liked what you saw tonight or didn't, because thankfully I'm not the only one usually presenting on our, for our tech talks. Like I said earlier, Philip will be joining us in September. Our recordings are available on our website, but also my social media. And I wanted to mention this shameless plug. Part of the reason I put so much effort into producing all the visuals and media you saw tonight in tonight's webinar, besides the fact that I love you all very much, is the fact that I'm planning on producing many more pieces of not webinar content independently surrounding this subject, among other subjects. And if you haven't seen already, I've started publishing a bunch of content to my social media. And while it's mostly been slow motion, like good MA skiers type videos and skiing hype type videos so far, I'm going to be publishing a lot more educational content soon. Most of the long form content will end up on YouTube, and sort of the more short reel TikTok type format stuff will end up on Instagram, which also gets cross posted to Facebook. So find me on there. Usually Brandon Bock, one word, is where you can find me. Just look for this profile picture you see on the right, at least as the time of this broadcast. I'll paste the links in the chat here shortly, and so I'll shut up now. Thank you all for coming out tonight. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to stick around. I'm also very much open to feedback on what you thought about how everything was presented tonight. The joystick analogy was a very original idea that I'm playing with, and this has kind of been my first presentation of it. So yeah, thank you again, everyone. The floor is open to you guys.